forces. The government in Warsaw also plans an unprecedented rise in military spending, going from 2.4% of GDP towards 5% of GDP eventually. That's the highest military spending in the entire NATO alliance. Speaking relative to GDP, the target range for NATO countries is only 2%. The 5% figure even beats Poland's NATO ally, the United States. Right now, Washington spends around 3.5% of GDP on its military. Even though Poland's economy is a lot smaller than the US, this rise in defensive spending still gives it billions of dollars in additional funding. The Polish government is using this money to purchase tons of military equipment to get the largest land army in Europe. With deals like this, Poland is trying to get one of the largest armies in Europe in terms of military hardware. And everyone who knows a bit of Polish history understands why. Poland doesn't want to get wrecked by other European countries ever again. Looking at the actions of the government in Warsaw, it seems like it's preparing for the worst case scenario, a war with Russia. When Putin invaded Ukraine, it became clear that peace in Eastern Europe is far from guaranteed. Right now, tensions are rising at the border between Belarus and Poland, with Polish and Belarusian troops preparing for the worst. When Putin sent Wagner troops to Belarus, Poland decided to move 10,000 troops to the border due to mounting concerns. After Prigozhin's death, Wagner isn't that big a concern anymore, but the tensions at the Belarusian border haven't gone away. Recently, Russia has moved short-range nuclear weapons to Belarus, further escalating the situation. Putin's dictator buddy, Lukashenko, is glad to help Russia in its conflict with the West, which has become a real threat to Warsaw. However, Poland isn't sitting idly and letting this happen. With its military buildup, Warsaw is trying to protect itself from its historical rival in the Kremlin. However, this military buildup goes far beyond that. Right now, Poland is on the path to become one of the strongest nations in Europe. Ranging from military might, economic growth to a strong network of alliances, Poland has it all. In this video, we'll talk about Poland's attempt to combat Russia with an unprecedented military buildup. We'll also go over the major geopolitical implications of this development. You see, Poland is using the military buildup to become one of the regional leaders of Europe. Before we dive into this video, consider hitting the like button down below. It helps the channel a lot, because videos like this don't get far without your support. The algorithm can be ruthless at times, especially when we cover military topics like this. Ultimately, you guys allowed us to make these videos. Thanks.
September the 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland. Within days, German forces are advancing on Warsaw. The nightmare of a new order. Hitler's Luftwaffe bombs cities, killing thousands of civilians. German planes destroy the Polish Air Force. Fear spreads in families. Within 2 weeks, Warsaw is surrounded.
The modern history of Poland is filled with wars and catastrophes. This is all indirectly caused by Poland's geography. Frankly, the country's geography is quite terrible when you look at national security aspects. Poland has no natural defenses, as it's located right at the heart of the European plain. The area is vulnerable to both the east and the west, which can clearly be seen in history. Repeatedly, Poland has been the stepping stone for any power expanding across the European plain. For the entire 19th century, Poland didn't even exist. The previous Polish state fell, partly because of its hardly defendable geography. The territory became occupied by the Prussians in the west, the Russians in the east, and the Habsburg monarchy in the south. When Europe later descended into World War I, it was disastrous for the Poles. After Germany and Russia declared war, the front line fell right into their territory. Many Poles had to fight in the war, as 450,000 Poles died and 1 million were wounded. In 1916, around 2 million people from Poland were fighting the armies of Germany, Austria, or Russia. After the war ended, much of the country was destroyed because of intense warfare. The occupied territories of Poland were left in ruin. Indirectly, this was due to Poland's unfortunate geography. Because of its central and unprotected position on the map, the Polish territories were heavily targeted. The only positive side of the war was that Poland regained its independence shortly after. Seemingly, this was good news for the country. Poland didn't have to be involved in these terrible wars anymore, right? Well, no. In 1939, disaster struck the country once again. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland from two sides. Poland lost the unfair fight against these military giants with awful consequences. Both the East and West had to suffer from totalitarian military occupations, with Hitler and Stalin ruling over the country. We don't think you can get worse leaders than that. On top of that, Poland became a front line just like in World War I. The two dictators decided to fight each other, and Poland was the unfortunate country right in between. World War II left an even bigger scar on the country than the previous one, which it remembers to this day. An estimated 6 million Poles died during the war, which is 20% of the pre-war population. Half of the victims were Polish Jews, who were prosecuted by the Nazis. After this horrible episode of history, it didn't get a whole lot better for Poland. The country became ruled by communists in what is known as the Polish People's Republic. For decades, Warsaw was a satellite for Moscow and the USSR. You know, with the gulags and Stalin's left-wing totalitarianism. It was only in 1989 that Poland regained its independence when the Soviet Union fell. The last 30 years have been a very rare time in history where Poland has been relatively prosperous and secure. It has joined the European Union and the NATO alliance, which has given the country a break from all the chaos. Nevertheless, this Polish history is crucial to understand. The government in Warsaw knows fully well that peace and prosperity is far from ordinary. From a historical perspective, it makes perfect sense to try and bolster the Polish defenses. If Poland wants to defend itself as a vulnerable country on the European plain, it needs a strong military. The first steps in this direction were already made in 2012, when the Polish government released a 10-year technical modernization plan. This would improve the armed forces of Poland, as $15 billion worth of weapon purchases were planned. But in 2022, this historical notion of needing a strong military has become as relevant as ever. With the invasion of Ukraine, it has become clear that Europe isn't as safe as everyone thought it was. Ukraine, which is a neighbor of Poland, has experienced the threat from Moscow firsthand. With Putin's attack, many see the revival of Russian imperialism. This raised alarm bells in Warsaw, because Russian imperialism has hurt Poland many times in history. For Warsaw, the threat from Moscow is right next to its border. Poland already shares a border with Belarus, which is regarded as a puppet state for Putin. Southeast of Poland, Russia is trying to creep up on the Ukrainian border, although unsuccessfully. And we shouldn't forget the Kaliningrad exclave, which is a small chunk of Russia directly bordering Poland in the north. This area is highly militarized, and it's sometimes called Russia's fortress on the Baltic Sea. From all of these sides, Poland is threatened by Russia, but the nation itself isn't at risk, right? As Poland is part of NATO, Russia wouldn't dare to attack the country's territory. Because of Article 5 of NATO, a Russian attack would get Moscow at war with the entire alliance, including the United States. An attack on one member state is treated as an attack on everyone. While this is completely true, it doesn't take away all of the fear in Poland. The country will be one of the first targets in case of a full-on war, even when it's unlikely to happen. The Suwalki Gap between Poland and Lithuania is the only way for NATO to access the Baltic states. This gap is one of the weakest points of the alliance. If Putin decides to attack NATO, he will probably go for such a choke point first. Now, it seems irrational for Russia to attack NATO, but Warsaw can't rely on this assumption. After all, you don't want to bet your national security on what Putin decides to do. When Russia decides to attack Poland despite the counterattack, it will do a lot of damage before NATO can intervene. The westernmost parts of Belarus are only a 3-hour drive away from Warsaw. In the scenario that Russian and Belarusian troops attack, the capital city is immediately at risk. The northern cities close to the Kaliningrad enclave could also be attacked in an instant, and once NATO forces enter Poland, the initial front line will be in Polish territory. Because of the many lessons from history, Poland doesn't want this to happen ever again. Oh yeah, we should also mention what happened last time when Poland was attacked. The United Kingdom and France promised to defend Poland just before World War II started. When Germany and Russia invaded, however, they were unable to help the country until it was too late. Arguably, NATO support for Poland nowadays is a lot more powerful and trustworthy. When we look at this map of NATO members in Europe, it's obvious that the group is stronger than just France and the UK. If the group fights together with the United States, Russia stands little to no chance. But still, there's a sense of mistrust in Poland after the World War II trauma. The country doesn't want to be over-reliant on others for national defense, so it wants to be able to defend itself when necessary. Because of this, Warsaw has made the decision to create a strong army to resist a possible Russian attack. Even though it is an unlikely scenario, a strong Polish military would guarantee that Russian forces won't come too far. After all, it's better to stop them at the borders than to wait for NATO support. Now, all of this geopolitical turmoil wouldn't have started without the war in Ukraine. Poland is firmly aligned with the Ukrainian cause and has a lot of sympathy for its neighboring country. Since the war started a year ago, the Polish government and civil society have helped out millions of refugees. But Poland is also closely allied with Ukraine in a military sense. A big reason for this is that Ukrainian loss would be a security hazard for Poland itself. This strategic interest shows when it comes to the military support the country is given. It was the first country to deliver Leopard tanks to Ukraine, while other countries like Germany were hesitant at first. In general, Poland is one of the NATO members least reluctant to support Ukraine militarily. In the first months of the war, Poland was the second biggest donor of military aid to Ukraine, only surpassed by the United States. This is quite the achievement of a country of only 38 million people, and still gives some of the biggest support on a per capita basis. As a share of GDP, Poland's level of support is only beaten by the Baltic states. 0.68% of Poland's gross domestic product is going to Ukraine, mostly in the form of military aid. But these numbers also say a lot about the support of other European countries. There are many nations in Europe that have bigger populations and economies than Poland, but the amount of support they give isn't proportional. Countries like France and Germany, with economies multiple times bigger than Poland, give much less to Ukraine, relatively speaking. The UK gives about 0.33% of GDP, Germany 0.27%, and France only 0.05%. Of course, these countries have the freedom to decide what they want to give to the war effort. But from Poland's perspective, this is very telling. Other European countries don't take Russia as seriously as it does. This fits a long trend of Western Europe not doing much for its national defense. They're not that scared of Russia because of NATO Article 5. When it comes to a war, the United States will do much of the work for them. And frankly, countries in Western Europe face less risks apart from Russian nuclear bombs. This has led to countries like Germany or the United Kingdom outsourcing a part of their national security. Recently, a US general has warned the British Army that it's no longer a top-level fighting force. The UK, which once had the best navy in the world, is currently unable to fight a war by itself. After an assessment, it was revealed that the country would run out of ammunition within a few days of war, and if it were bombarded with the same kind of drones and missiles as Ukraine, the UK wouldn't be able to properly defend itself. This is because much of the country's defense systems and armor have become outdated and obsolete. On top of that, the number of British military personnel is in a freefall. The number of military personnel has been slashed by more than 50% since 1990. The slump in personnel is even worse in Germany, and France also has a drop of about 40%. Germany's military, aka the Bundeswehr, is also in a very bad shape, and that's according to the chief of the German army. On the day that Russia's invasion of Ukraine began, he said that the Bundeswehr, the army that I'm allowed to lead, is more or less depleted. In a high-intensity combat, the Bundeswehr stock would run out in a few hours or days. This decline in German military strength is very obvious, especially with hardware. In 1989, the Bundeswehr used to have 5,000 battle tanks, and now only has 300. It used to have 620 fighter jets. This amount is now reduced to 230. The military used to have 2,100 armed personnel carriers back then. 3 decades later, it's down to 700. You get the point. The German army has become a lot weaker than it was just 30 years ago. For years now, Germany hasn't met NATO's requirement to spend 2% of GDP on the military. When you don't spend enough on the military well, it won't be as capable as you want it to be. France suffers from the same problems, although to a lesser extent. France's ammunition supplies are at their lowest point ever, according to a recent report. It wouldn't last more than a few weeks of high-intensity combat because of a lack of ammunition. This is still more than Britain or Germany, but it's not a figure to be proud of. Now, back to Poland. With the major European nations losing their military prowess, Europe's security is fragile. Other European powers have become weaker over the years, which makes NATO's defense mostly dependent on the United States. Of course, the United States has the best military in the world, at least when we look at defense spending. But putting all your eggs in one basket is never a good idea. When there's no NATO member in Europe who's able to fight a war, that is a huge weakness. And currently, it doesn't look like countries in Western Europe fit the bill for securing Europe's safety. The West of Europe takes Russia less seriously than the East, which is obvious when you look at defense spending and support to Ukraine. Poland is trying to compensate for the security hazard by building the largest army in Europe. If this goal is achieved, Poland will be able to protect Europe without outside support.
Poland is one of the fastest rising business destinations in the world.
Joe Biden touching down in Poland.
The Three Seas Initiative is a project that was created. The initiative is so named because it links 12 European Union countries located between 3 different seas: the Baltic Sea to the north, the Black Sea to the southeast, and the Adriatic Sea to the southwest. It is a movement created in 2015 to carry out projects in 3 areas: infrastructure, energy, and telecommunication.
So, Poland is taking on the burden of European security because other countries have weakened. This seems to be an entirely selfless move, but this is not the case. On the contrary, Poland will actually gain a lot from this strategy. When Poland surpasses the UK, Germany, and France in military might, the country will get an important geopolitical status. This will give Poland a lot of benefits, and it fits in a wider trend. Believe it or not, Poland is on the way to become a major global power. This is true in a lot of aspects, including the economic side of international affairs. Poland is projected to overtake the UK in GDP per capita by 2030, which is pretty remarkable. For decades, Eastern European countries have been poorer than their Western European counterparts. After decades-long Soviet rule, the east of Europe was left impoverished and dysfunctional. But this situation seems to be changing, as countries like Poland are growing their economy at incredible rates. The Polish economy has been growing consecutively for 28 years, an achievement only surpassed by Australia in modern history. In fact, Poland was the only country in the EU that didn't suffer from the 2008 economic crisis. Between 1992 and 2019, economic growth in the country averaged 4.2% annually. As economists say, compound interest can do miracles. It certainly did in Poland. From 1990 onwards, the country's GDP has increased 7-fold. In terms of total GDP change over the last 30 years, China was the only country who has beaten Poland. The country experienced an economic miracle of some sorts, and the Polish economy was entirely transformed. Its economy changed from one of the worst performing in Europe into one of the world's bigger and more prosperous ones. Already, Poland has the 22nd biggest economy in the world, and the country is continuing to climb up the ranks. There are many reasons for this success, one of them being Poland's EU membership. In 2004, the government in Warsaw decided to join the European Union, which had a huge economic upside. Since then, businesses in Poland could trade freely within the European Union. Currently, the EU has a combined nominal GDP of $17 trillion, so that's a big deal. Private business is booming in Poland, partly because it has access to this huge EU market. On top of that, Poland receives a lot of investments from other countries in the European Union. The policy of the organization is that the richer members give money to the poorer ones to invest in their growth. On this chart, you can see that Germany is the biggest contributor and that Poland is the biggest beneficiary. Since 2004, Poland has received 232 billion euros from the EU budget. The country is using these funds to build infrastructure like roads or railways, amongst other things. But apart from the outside support, domestic factors have also played a role in Poland's success. Poland has a highly skilled workforce, which has resulted in success in sectors such as IT. About 8% of Poland's GDP comes from the IT sector, and the country currently houses 60,000 technology companies. Global giants such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Intel have all established bases in Poland. This fits in a wider trend of global businesses moving to the nation because of the talent available there. But apart from its EU membership and talent pool, the biggest reason for Poland's success is this. Arguably, the last 30 years were the most peaceful in the last 400 years of Polish history. Poland is catching up to the rest of Europe because it finally has the peace and independence that others have had for longer. If this time of peace continues, Poland can build itself up to be one of the major players in Europe. To illustrate this, let's go back 400 years in time. In the Middle Ages, Poland was home to a powerful and successful state called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. At its peak in the late 16th and early 17th century, the Federation spanned much of Eastern Europe. At times, the state was even the largest in Europe. For a brief period, the Federation actually conquered Moscow, which hasn't been done too often in history. Eventually, the Commonwealth disintegrated. The idea of this powerful state in Eastern Europe never disappeared. After World War I, the idea of an intermarium was born in Poland. Translated as between the seas, it would be a federation spanning from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic Sea. This state would be able to counterbalance Germany in the west and Russia in the east, and it would give Eastern Europe a time of peace and prosperity. This idea never came to be because of divides between Eastern European states. Poland fought a war with both Lithuania and Ukraine, which made an alliance in the region impossible. On top of that, the Soviets began to push back on this idea. Learning from past experience, Moscow didn't want a revival of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Polish Civil War from 1919 to 1921 made this very clear. The Polish side won the war, but they made some big concessions in the peace treaty. Poland would give up on the intermarium concept and recognize Ukraine and Belarus as Soviet proxy states, and we all know what happened next. Because there was no strong federation in Eastern Europe, Poland and its neighboring nations were crushed during World War II, but the idea of an intermarium wasn't gone at all. In fact, it still exists today. Poland is trying to reunite Eastern Europe to finally make the intermarium idea into reality. This could provide a new security bloc, which could guarantee the peace and prosperity of the region. The Polish president, Andrzej Duda, is leading the process, as he co-founded the Three Seas Initiative in 2016. The initiative is centered between the Baltic, Adriatic, and Black Sea, currently taking inspiration from the intermarium idea. The project is supposed to increase cooperation between 12 EU member states: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Austria, Hungary, Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria. The non-EU member Ukraine is a partner participant in the program as the de facto 13th member. The main focus of the project is infrastructure and energy, but it also has some big geopolitical motives. You see, Poland is trying to establish a leading role in the area. With the Three Seas Initiative, Poland is challenging the traditional EU leaders by creating its own group within the organization. Countries like Germany or France don't like this, as it would challenge their authority within the EU. But for Poland, becoming a regional leader has a lot of benefits. Poland would lead the wave of economic development in the East and gain a lot of status internationally. Now, Poland's ambitious military plans fit right into its regional agenda. Building the largest military in Europe seems like a little over the top for a country of only 38 million people, but it makes perfect sense when you're trying to become a regional leader. With the largest army in Europe, Poland isn't only able to protect itself, but also its allies. So when Poland gets a huge military, it incentivizes other countries in Eastern Europe to become close allies. This would make Poland's dream of an intermarium very possible, as it could become a country with a lot of status. So, Poland's military plans aren't only to protect itself against a possible attack, they're also for Poland to become a regional leader with all the benefits attached to it. For example, the relationship between Poland and the United States has vastly improved in the last year. This is because Washington now recognizes the strategic importance of the country. Previously, the Polish government was under scrutiny because of controversial judicial changes, but because of the war in Ukraine, this has all been brushed over. Because of its military buildup and its leadership role in the region, Poland has now become an indispensable NATO member. For the United States, Poland is crucial for defending NATO's eastern flank. On top of that, Washington kind of likes the idea of a strong Polish military. The US doesn't want to be the only one defending Europe from Russia. With something like a Cold War going between the US and China, the United States needs to focus elsewhere. The Polish military buildup allows this to happen because it can build a power vacuum. It's clear that a strategic alliance between Poland and the United States has been formed. With Joe Biden visiting the country twice within 12 months, the United States has recently established a permanent base in Poland, which shows that the country is becoming a hub for NATO's defenses. On top of that, the US has pledged to make Poland one of the most capable armies in Europe. It will provide arms deals for the most advanced weapon systems in the world, including the Patriot missile system or HIMARS rocket launchers. A US strategy document has highlighted this agenda, saying that America will support Poland to become a top-tier NATO ally and the principal regional leader. With help from Washington, Poland can become a military powerhouse. It can provide local military security to Eastern Europe, gaining influence in the region and internationally. Poland has multiple reasons for the recent military buildup, but what will this increase in military strength actually look like? First of all, Poland's military spending will rise to a figure of about $30 billion annually. Currently, the country is spending 4% of GDP on the military. According to some reports, this could rise to 5% over the coming years. This won't get Poland in the top 10 of military spenders globally, but this spending will be countries like Israel or Canada. However, we have to keep in mind that Poland is still one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. Economists expect the Polish GDP to surpass $1 trillion in 2028. This means that the nation's defense spending could rise to $50 billion by the end of the decade. When it sticks to the 5% goal, in theory, the country could catch up with Germany or France in the near future. Now, all of this money will be spent for one purpose: protecting Eastern Eastern Europe against Russia. Luckily for Poland, it already has the playbook on how to do this. From the war in Ukraine, the West has learned a lot about how modern warfare with Russia looks. One of the biggest lessons from the conflict is that numbers matter. The more ammunition, tanks, and soldiers you have, the bigger your chances of success. This is because conflicts like the war in Ukraine are fought for months or even years on end. It's not only about getting the most high-tech equipment and weaponry, although that can give you a nice advantage. Instead, it's about getting enough hardware and personnel to last for a while. That's why Poland is focusing very much on the numbers. It wants a huge amount of military personnel and large inventories of artillery and tanks. In 2022 alone, the Polish military got 14,000 new recruits. This is part of the new military recruitment campaign called Become a Soldier of Poland. Even though the country doesn't have a very big population, the government wants to recruit 150,000 people. This is going to double the size of the military over the coming years, and it will make Poland a capable force for prolonged conflicts. The other number that the Polish military focuses on is the amount of firepower. One of the reasons that Ukraine has resisted the Russian attack for so long is the huge amount of firepower it now has. The country has received a lot of artillery, armored vehicles, and tanks from NATO, which allows Ukraine to defend against Russian troops. Based on visual evidence, Russia has lost more than 2,000 tanks, 2,000 infantry vehicles, and 2,500 trucks and jeeps. The fact that Ukraine could inflict these massive losses is a big reason for Russia failing to advance. Looking at Ukraine's arsenal, there are many resources it has used to make this happen. One of these resources is the HIMARS long-range artillery system. It has helped Ukraine destroy a lot of Russian positions and armor. Poland took note of this. Over the years, it wants to buy nearly 500 HIMARS artillery systems from the United States. That's an insane amount of artillery, as the United States doesn't even have that many. 500 is about the global supply of HIMARS before the war. The systems are very powerful, as they have a range of about 300 kilometers. One in the middle of Poland can reach most of the 700-kilometer wide country, so imagine 500 of those. On top of that, Warsaw is going to buy 300 K239 Chunmu systems. They are the South Korean equivalent of the HIMARS system, providing the army with even more long-range artillery firepower. When it comes to self-propelled artillery, the plans are just as ambitious. The Polish-made Crab howitzer has already proven itself in Ukraine, and Warsaw is ramping up its production of the artillery piece. With current orders, the number of Crabs in the military will rise to 170 pieces, but according to previous security documents, this number could rise to 500 once the production capability is there. The Crab's howitzer has been highly effective in the war in Ukraine, which Zelensky has personally discussed with his Polish colleague, Duda. To further solidify the arsenal of howitzers, Poland's army will also acquire tons of South Korean K9A1s. The plan is to buy about 700 of them, which will also consist of the Polonized version named K9PL. In 2026, the manufacturing of K9PL howitzers will start in Poland as part of a technology transfer with Korea. When all of these plans get realized, Warsaw will get one of the most formidable arsenals of artillery in the world. This is no coincidence. In a potential war with Russia, artillery will be one of the most decisive factors. Going into the war in Ukraine, Russia thought that its immense arsenal of artillery would guarantee it a swift victory. According to some estimates, the Russian army started with 5,000 howitzers and rocket launchers. In the first months of the conflict, Russian troops fired 60,000 artillery shells a day. Due to a variety of reasons, however, this offensive didn't work out. Russia's tactics were outdated, it quickly faced shell shortages, and its soldiers weren't trained properly. But the biggest reason why the Russian artillery offensive didn't work was this. Ukraine had an effective counter-artillery defensive. In the conflict, artillery on artillery combat has been one of the decisive factors. When Russia invaded, Ukraine's artillery was one of the biggest reasons why Kiev wasn't captured. Ukraine began the war with an estimated 1,800 artillery pieces, which put it at a disadvantage against Russia on paper. But because of a more effective campaign, Ukraine was able to destroy much of the Russian artillery